Good evening and welcome. Thank you for joining us for the 42nd Cardinal's Dinner. It's an event that supports so many worthwhile charities right across our Archdiocese that do such vital work, thanks to your generous support. Thank you. This is our second virtual Cardinal's Dinner as we continue under the constraints of a pandemic that has taxed our minds, bodies, and indeed our souls. We miss the opportunity to gather in person and look forward to a time when we can come together once again. From wherever you are joining us tonight, I wish you and your loved ones all the blessings of our merciful and loving God. The theme for tonight's dinner is our journey towards healing and reconciliation. Today, Toronto is home to the largest Indigenous population in Ontario and the fourth largest in our country. I'm speaking with you from St. Anne's Church in Toronto. St. Anne's is home to the Archdiocese's Native Peoples Mission. The mission was established in 1972 to serve the growing Indigenous population in Toronto. So as we begin our program this evening and prepare to reflect on the theme of healing and reconciliation, let us begin with prayer.
Bonjour, Ani, Rosella Kinoshmeg, Nishnikas. Hello, my name is Rosella Kinoshmeg. Doganing Ukwemkong Nadomnising Don Jaba. I am from South Bay, Ukwemkong unceded territory, Manitoulin Island. Naing Bindoeshin, Wasanamikaning, Wimnam Nido Wendamang, We Nojamoyang. I am with you from the Anishinaabe Spiritual Center in Espanola, Ontario, a place of enlightenment for spiritual nourishment, growth, and healing. Wimna Nojamoyang, Gogindan Manda, Animewin, Miigwet Shwing, Chitwa Kadri, Tekakwita. It is in the spirit of healing that I am pleased to share the prayer for Thanksgiving for St. Kadri, Tekakwita. I also want to acknowledge that although we are participating tonight from many different places, we are all on lands traditionally occupied by Indigenous peoples. Land acknowledgement need not only be a symbolic gesture. It's an ongoing opportunity to always keep Indigenous peoples at the forefront as Catholics and children of God as we journey together on the path to healing and reconciliation. Odishnikas winning, Wilsman, Gay Wigsman, Gay Wenjishit, Nedo, Miging. Nosnan, God our Father, whom Kadri Tekakwitha like to call the Great Spirit, we thank you for having given us this young woman as a model of the Christian life. Despite her frailness and her community's resistance, she bore witness to the presence of Christ. With her companions, she drew close to the elderly and to the sick. Every day she saw in nature a reflection of your own glory and beauty. Grant that by intercession we may always be close to you, more sensitive to the needs of those around us, and more respectful of creation. With her we shall strive to discover what pleases you and endeavor to accomplish it until the day you call us back to you. Amen. Thank you and God bless you. Miigwech, Joen Mishnang, Gejemnedo, Deben Miang.
Thank you, Rosella, and thank you for sharing that beautiful prayer to St. Kadri Tekakwitha. For many centuries, Indigenous Catholics have been a blessing for the whole Church, a reality which was acknowledged in the 2012 canonization of St. Kadri Tekakwitha, North America's first Indigenous saint. She is but one radiant example of the countless Indigenous Catholics who have inspired the whole of our community of faith. That spiritual tradition needs to be celebrated with deep appreciation. Over the past many months, there has been a national conversation in our country relating to residential schools and the ongoing journey to healing and reconciliation with Indigenous peoples. The Catholic Church and its role in the Government of Canada's residential school system has been central to that conversation. Religious orders and dioceses of the Church should never have associated themselves with a destructive government policy that was designed to separate children from their families. It was wrong. We need to look to the past to acknowledge the truth, even if it is painful, as we do when we go to confession in our personal lives. From that can come repentance, deeper understanding, and a resolution through God's grace to sin no more. I, along with my fellow bishops from across Canada and all faithful Catholics, will continue to do all that is possible to repair relationships with Indigenous peoples. It will be a lengthy journey, and we know that many Catholic and Indigenous leaders throughout the country have been working together on the reconciliation journey for many years. We must redouble existing efforts and expand our reach in meaningful ways. I want to ensure that our Catholic community is aware of significant developments in recent months. Last June, the Catholic Bishops of Canada confirmed that a delegation of Indigenous people will meet with the Holy Father in late December of this year. The visit is the result of 3 years of preparation, with the journey to Rome delayed due to pandemic restrictions. This pastoral visit will include the participation of a diverse group of elders, knowledge keepers, residential school survivors, and youth from across the country, accompanied by a small group of bishops and Indigenous leaders. Last month, it was announced that Pope Francis has accepted the invitation of the Canadian bishops to visit Canada on a pilgrimage of healing and reconciliation. The December delegation to Rome will allow the Holy Father to hear the stories of survivors. This dialogue will also help to provide a foundation for the papal visit to our country. These occasions are important outward and public signs of our commitment to healing and reconciliation. What is also important is that we look inward as Catholics, and indeed as Canadians, to listen to the call for true healing and reconciliation, and to answer that call with prayer and meaningful action. We particularly are resolved to repent for the lack of respect shown to the Indigenous people of this land, made especially evident in the residential schools. We also should recognize and celebrate the beauty, truth, and goodness offered to our whole community in the traditions and history of the Indigenous people, and especially within the Catholic Church. I have been heartened to hear from so many of the faithful who wish to be directly engaged in this journey. The Archdiocese is working with our clergy, staff, and parishioners to educate ourselves through webinars, discussion groups, and the sharing of other resources. It is important we all have an understanding of the truth. The Canadian bishops also announced in September a $30 million commitment to support Indigenous peoples and communities as part of the reconciliation journey. The Archdiocese has established a fund that is accepting donations from the Catholic faithful. In planning to fulfill the Archdiocese of Toronto's share of this commitment, we are consulting with diverse Indigenous voices to help us discern how our financial support can best meet the needs of Indigenous peoples and groups in our Archdiocese and elsewhere in Canada. Supporters of this dinner also have the option of enhancing these efforts, along with the support you have traditionally and generously provided to the agencies funded by the Cardinal's dinner. These past several months have been difficult for Catholics and Canadians as we face many truths about our historic relationships with our Indigenous brothers and sisters. In addition to prayer and action, it is critical that we listen to Indigenous voices. I now invite you to listen to Indigenous and other Catholic partners who have so generously shared their experience, wisdom, and faith as part of our collective journey of healing and reconciliation.
I was born in the Tubig First Nation, which is up in Victoria County, New Brunswick, in 1946, and I come from a large family.
I am Black Métis. My Black heritage stems from Nova Scotia and the history of the Black Loyalists there. And my Métis roots stem back to Moose Factory, Ontario, which is in the far north, close to James Bay.
I'm Ojibwe, originally from Sault Ste. Marie area with Garden River First Nations. I'm a Bear Clan, and right now we're at St. Anne's Parish, and I've been here in the parish since '72.
I am Indigenous First Nations and a member of the Niska'a Nation, which is on the northwest coast of BC. I am a Catholic and I'm a parishioner at St. Gregory's Parish in Toronto. And my ministries involve being a catechist as well as working a lot in evangelization.
I was appointed Lieutenant Governor of New Brunswick in 2009 for a 5-year term to 2014.
My family on my father's side is Stalo, from the Fraser River Valley in British Columbia.
When I started grade 1 for the very first time in 1951, that's the first time I ever heard English. And but as a result of that experience, actually I failed grade 1 because I couldn't read English. And so I continued on next year to continue in grade 1, and after that I made sure I worked hard, and wonderfully I say I finished high school.
I currently hold the position there of Legal and Strategic Advisor, Indigenous Initiatives. It's a role I took on in January of 2020 after being a litigation lawyer at the firm for about 39 years.
St. Anne's was very open to for us as Native people for doing the ceremonies. Like they incorporated, well, we incorporated the drumming and purification ceremonies, and sometimes there's dancers, like sometimes we'd have dancers at a special occasion.
When I first became Catholic, it's because when I first stepped into a Catholic church, I immediately felt like I was at home. I didn't feel on the outside at all.
I do the ceremonies every Sunday. We do the ceremonies before the Mass, and I'm a Eucharistist minister here.
As I continued to come to the church, I started to volunteer my time for different things, and I learned how to be a sacristan. I was commissioned to be a Eucharistic minister, and now being commissioned as a catechist to continue for faith formation and teaching about the sacraments.
In the early history of the Jesuits among the First Nations peoples, really the roots of evangelization, in a sense, for the church in Canada at the time, we see that it wasn't about how many people could be baptized. It was about the authenticity in the desire to be baptized.
In fact, the early missionaries and subsequent leaders in the church said, yes, Jesus in his own body is Indian. I mean, that's what Pope John Paul II reminded the people in Ontario and Canada in September of 1984. So what happened in that beautiful evangelization that could and should have taken place in a peaceful way?
There may have been individuals within the residential school system who sort of took on the missionary work of the early missionaries who came here to Canada, like St. Jean de Brebeuf and his companions, right, who carried out evangelization with respect, with love, with understanding, with going that extra mile, I guess you could say, in understanding what the other culture is about, learning the language so that you can communicate in the same way. So I think there may have been individuals who tried to do that, but the history shows us that, and the evidence shows us that that did not happen often enough.
I have to go back to the time of the baptism of the Grand Chief And remember too, on June 24th, 1610, and that was one of the earliest baptisms in this part of the world anyway, and he agreed to become a Catholic, and he told the French priests who were there, you have to learn Mi'kmaq, you have to come and teach our people about who Jesus is. And so because the early missionaries taught the indigenous people in this area, the Mi'kmaq and the Wolastoqiyik, that Christ himself was Indian, and that's in their catechisms.
The Jesuits themselves believed, of course, these are fully human persons with souls that we have an obligation, in a sense, to share our experience of Christ with, out of a fundamental principle that all Jesuits have, but all Christians have, that somehow a fulfillment of the human experience involves a knowing and loving relationship with Christ.
I took the time this past summer to read through Pope Benedict's his book, Truth and Tolerance. In the book, he talks about proposing truth, not imposing it. And he speaks about how given the plurality of cultures and faiths around the world, what we want to aim to do is foster unity in that multiplicity.
I don't see the difference between Indigenous spirituality and our Catholic faith because of enculturation. I mean, we have the same God. We may call them God different names, but the Father of Jesus is God the Father. And also for us, we have a name for our Creator as well. And that's why enculturation at the very beginning could have been so beautiful.
He uses the Trinity as an example of the perfect unity and multiplicity, right? 3 persons in one. And that we are to reflect that same reality in how we live out the Christian faith here on earth. But that can only be done with love and with respect for freedom. So yeah, that just really resonated with me, because given our current context right now, that's not how evangelization was done in this instance. And I wouldn't call it evangelization, actually, because that's not what it was.
Well, I agree with Cardinal Collins for sure that way. There's no doubt, I mean, that the message of what Jesus had was unfortunately, sadly interpreted by whoever his messengers were of the different religions. And you just cannot remove people from their families, because in our Catholic faith, we always say that the family is a little church. So it's there where the message of Jesus and all the other elements of our Catholic faith should have been taught.
The residential school system was about assimilating the Indigenous child into Euro-Canadian society, and that meant killing the Indian in the child is the often quoted phrase. And that is the antithesis to true evangelization.
For some reason, through arrogance or egoism, we don't know, the colonial policymakers decided that the Indigenous people were savages, that they were inferior, and that they were a problem now and no longer a help. And so they instituted policies and enacted laws, racist policies and laws, whose main aim was to cause Indigenous people to cease to exist as legal, social, and societal entities through a process of assimilation. And those policies relied on a very key tool, which was residential schools. And the purpose of residential schools was to tear the children away from their families, Indigenous children away from their families, and forcibly convert them into the Christian European culture.
We were in day schools on the reserve from the time we were till about 14, 15 years old. And it was like a lot of abuse there too. The teachers were really very cruel to all of us that were in the schools. Like we were beaten and stuff like that. And if my parents complained, they'll call the RCMP.
At the very beginning, the church and the governments and RCMP as well, before that, the mounted police were all in concert and trying to say, this is what we think is right, this is what we think is best for these children. And they never involved the people within the community, the parents and the grandparents. This is where everything went to what I call amok.
But the way they did it was wrong, like just taking small kids and, you know, from their parents, like they're like 4 or 5 years old, taking them away. And the abuse that happened, that should not have happened.
The history of residential schools and the broader colonial project that it was a part of is not just a Catholic problem, it's not just a Canadian problem, it's a human problem. It's a human problem. And I think when we start talking about it in terms of a human issue, we can move away from the dichotomies that we tend to set up for ourselves and the categories that we tend to set up for ourselves, or us versus them, because that's not helpful to reconciliation.
It's important for us to be able to separate the sins that have occurred from what we are taught in our tradition, which is to show Jesus' love to people. And so being able to communicate and speak with people about what the church is supposed to be rather than what it has been turned into and what it has been is such an important part of this healing process as well.
I struggle every day to understand how or why the church got involved in this. It likely was because the churches were the primary source of education at the time anyways. The governmental policies of assimilation, of treating Indigenous people as inferior, were now ever present. And the government reached out to the Christian schools, the Catholic schools, Anglican, and others, and asked them to help implement that policy using the infrastructure the churches already had in place. But sadly, the churches didn't understand or didn't think about the underlying purpose of these policies, which was forced conversion, which, as we all know, is a perversion of everything we believe in as Catholics. And so what you ended up with is a system that from its very beginning was wrong and it was evil. And because it wasn't very well organized or supervised or regulated, it became a hotbed for abusers.
What helps me in this struggle is looking to those residential school survivors who have experienced immense trauma, trauma that is unimaginable, and who still hold fast to their faith, who have somehow found healing through their Catholic faith specifically.
Traditional dance for Indigenous people, especially at powwows and other festivals, is considered a form of prayer. And so when we go out to dance in a circle or go out to dance anywhere, we consider that to be a lifting up of prayer to God. And so when I'm dancing, what I'm reflecting on is prayers of blessing for people who are watching. So being mindful of knowing that people who are watching me maybe are looking for healing or for prayers for something. One dance in particular that I like performing is a traditional welcoming dance that would be performed at Potlatch on the Northwest Coast. And for that, I wear a traditional button blanket.
The first thing that we have is the four colors. It represents the four directions, north, south, east, and west. And it also represents the four colors of man. The meaning for the ceremony is earth, wind, fire, and water. And what it represents is all the elements that we need to survive on this earth.
I find there are beautiful similarities between the Catholic faith and Indigenous traditions and values. And the more that I learn and grow in my Indigenous traditions, and the more that I learn and love about the Church, I find that the cultures and the traditions are so intertwined. It's beautiful. I really don't see that there's conflict at all that happens between the two traditions and the faiths. In fact, some of the similarities include the values of love and humility, treating people with honor and respect, and treating them with human dignity.
The ceremony always begins in the east, then we go to the south, the west, the north, and Mother Earth and the Creator which means God.
I've never seen a body of people, a society, so deeply ingrained in a universal kind of spirituality that touched absolutely every aspect of their being.
The medicines that we burn is the sage, sweetgrass, tobacco, and cedar. And these are the four elements that was given to the Native people long ago to use as sacred medicines.
There's absolutely a place for Indigenous youth and young adults in the Church. I think they are our next generation. They are what's going to help us to continue to walk forward towards reconciliation, towards healing. And the more that we can continue to teach them the values and traditions that we have, the more that they can learn and the more that they can teach us as well, and continue to teach the next generations, and in a continuing chain throughout time.
It's important to maintain hope, because if you fall into cynicism or pessimism, whatever you want to call it, you're going to lose any sort of impetus to move forward. And it's important that we do that. It's important not to remain paralyzed, but to continue in this work of reconciliation.
I'm sad that it took the discovery of unmarked graves in Kamloops for Canadians and for Catholics to come to the realization of the terrible legacy of residential schools. But I'm heartened by the fact that now they've seen this pain and suffering and what it must mean to the Indigenous people, that Canadians generally and Catholics in particular are taking active and genuine steps towards reconciliation.
If the general Catholic out there, general Christian faith, does not know the pain that our people suffer, is not aware of the government policies that made it illegal for our people to exercise our faith, that made it illegal if the children were not removed and sent to school, that made it an offense for mom and dad and grandparents to try to prevent this. That's the power of the state. And I think the people, if you don't know the mistakes of history, you're going to repeat them. And I think that is what's going to happen if Indigenous people are not involved in this path toward reconciliation.
And those first steps are developing awareness of the issues and understanding of the pain and suffering, and then taking steps forward by listening to the stories, listening to the Indigenous people, and working with them, journeying with them towards reconciliation as a joint effort.
I think it's moving forward slow. It's moving forward, but very slowly. Like it's moving very slowly ahead, and I think it needs a lot of more work to be done and a lot of more recognition of Native people and their culture.
The tragedy of the Indian residential schools has had a wide impact across this nation. For me personally, seeing the revelations of these graves that have been uncovered and hearing about the stories that have come out of this, this isn't anything that's new to the Indigenous people. This is something that we've known about for so long now, and I think the fact that there's this evidence now that is coming out has had a larger impact on our nation and the people who are learning about it. There's a great sadness that we feel, and a great grief and mourning and loss. There's going to take time to grieve. It's going to take a time of patience, and it might take quite a while.
Well, first of all, we have to know our history. You know, as back as 1537, Pope Paul III of the day recognized Indigenous people as being human beings, as having property rights, and having dignity, even if they be outside the faith of Jesus Christ. And that was a papal statement back in 1537. And that's the same message that Pope John Paul II also reinforced in Yellowknife in 1984 and repeated in 1987.
I think there are those who went through the system and who now, and understandably so, have a terrible view of the church. But there are those who have also gone through it and have found healing through the church as well. And I think that's an example of how, despite this history, there are those who will still proclaim to be Christian, not because of the violent assimilation that they've experienced, but despite of it.
That'll be a very significant step for the Indigenous people, because they know then their voices will have been heard and their pain and suffering have been acknowledged. And it'll be a very important step, or a significant step, for Canadians at large, because Canadians at large will see that this suffering and pain has been recognized.
We have the delegation coming up in December of 2021, where Indigenous leaders and representatives will travel to the Vatican and meet with the Holy Father over the course of a number of days.
I have great hope for the delegation that's going to Rome and for the papal visit to Canada. I think this is a wonderful opportunity for going ahead, for moving ahead.
I'm looking forward for the apology from the Pope, if he's going to make an apology, but I don't think it's going to be soon. But I think he might, especially if he comes to Canada. And I hope that like Native people are able to accept it.
Catholics all look to the Pope for leadership. And the fact that the Pope is coming to Canada to meet with Indigenous people, and I anticipate and I hope to listen to them, really listen to them, and really understand the difficult and terrible journey they've had here at the hands of the Canadian government and the Catholic Church and the other churches, and hopefully understand and respect the resilience of the Indigenous people in the face of all that.
I know we've had apologies throughout the past from church leaders and from different people in the church and the government, but sometimes we need to be able to hear that again.
That's going to mean so much to so many who are still struggling with the wounds of this system, either because they went through it firsthand or they're suffering from the intergenerational effects of it. So I think having the Holy Father coming here is a beautiful expression of his sort of fatherly love for the church here in Canada.
So I think this delegation to Rome and having the Pope to come to Canada is a beautiful way of that communication. A coming together where, like I had mentioned, sitting down and talking to people, having that conversation, speaking to each other, listening to each other, and having patience and showing love for each other.
Read the TRC 94 Calls to Action, that's number one, because that outlines the process of how reconciliation was supposed to take place in our country, because that involves not only governments and at all levels, federal, provincial, and municipal, but it also mentions educational institutions.
There are several different issues that also are facing the Indigenous people of the nation, and they're all connected. And whether it's the Indian residential schools or missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls or clean drinking water on reservations, all of these things are connected.
My faith says yes, there is hope. The movement and the actions of the Catholic Church in recent years is very encouraging. They are attempting in a genuine way, I can't speak for all the Catholic churches, but the ones that I've been associated with are attempting in a genuine way to understand what reconciliation is about, to achieve the awareness they need to understand the depths and the complexity of the issues and of the harm done, and are taking steps to try to address that harm in a way that respects Indigenous culture, Indigenous spirituality, Indigenous traditions.
The best thing that Catholics can do to engage and to learn and to understand would be to get in contact and get in touch with Indigenous people and to ask them questions. There is sometimes resistance that will be met, where people might say, I'm not going to teach you about it, you have to learn yourself. I don't think that's necessarily a way of going forward so much. I think being able to speak with each other, to actually say words to each other, to be able to sit and listen back is extremely important.
I think if we're successful, then all churches in Canada, be it Anglican, Catholic, Presbyterian, United, all these different churches, if they accept the fact that Indigenous spirituality is a gift from God to our people and that we share this responsibility with our brothers and sisters of different faiths, it's only then, I think, that we can walk together.
Something good will come from this enormous struggle. And I think that's a sign of hope for us moving forward in reconciliation and healing, that there's always light, laboring, and grace, even in the most horrific of circumstances.
One of the, if you could put it this way, benefits that have come from this this unfolding of events in the past few months is that it has forced all of the country to confront this very dark history. And I know that for many that may be uncomfortable. Perhaps there's feelings of guilt. Perhaps there's just a paralysis and they don't know what to do. My hope is that we can move past those feelings, that we can actually address what's happened and move forward.
I think at this time, our Lord is providing the Catholic community in Canada an opportunity to receive a grace. And the grace is understanding, the grace is acceptance, the grace is saying, okay, how do we arise from these ashes so that there would be a better future for everybody?
So despite all of the hardship and tragedy and sorrow and grief that we are going through right now and processing, I still have great hope, and I know that there's going to be wonderful healing that comes through the communication and the walking towards this path of truth and reconciliation. And a dance that gives me great joy to perform is Fancy Shawl. And Fancy Shawl is considered to be a women's warrior dance. And as a woman warrior, we protect and defend the dignity of life, and we share joy and love and hope in the steps that we dance.
Special thanks to Father Michael Deacon Brown and the Honorable Graydon Nicholas, Elder John Robinson, Maria Lucas, and Julia Kozak. Thank you so very much for sharing your perspectives. Thank you for sharing your gifts of knowledge and abundant faith. Thank you most particularly for sharing your perspectives on the residential school system, the Catholic Church's role in the system, and the extensive journey of healing and reconciliation that remains. Since the 1990s, Catholic leaders, clergy, religious, and lay people have been engaged in the most important work, the listening, the dialogue, and the penance for our sins, and the personal encounter and journey to true reconciliation. As I have stated previously when speaking of abuse in the Church, the real scandal is when evil festers in the darkness. Once in the open, evil can be rooted out. That must continue to happen. Then new life can begin. Many Catholic institutions and religious orders have rightly apologized for their involvement in the residential school system. In 1991, the Missionary Oblates of Mary Immaculate in Canada, the Catholic order that operated the Kamloops Residential School and others, apologized for its role in the residential schools. In 2009, Pope Benedict expressed his great sorrow at the anguish caused by the deplorable conduct of some members of the Church, offering his sympathy and prayerful solidarity. In September, the Catholic Bishops of Canada made clear our profound remorse and issued its unequivocal apology. In solidarity with my fellow bishops, we will now read the statement of apology by the Catholic Bishops of Canada to the Indigenous people of this land. We, the Catholic Bishops of Canada, gathered in plenary this week, take this opportunity to affirm to you, the Indigenous peoples of this land, that we acknowledge the suffering experienced in Canada's Indian residential schools.
De nombreuses communautés religieuses et des diocèses catholiques ont servi dans ce système qui a conduit à la suppression des langues, de la culture et de la spiritualité autochtone, sans respecter la richesse de l'histoire, des traditions et de la sagesse des peuples autochtones.
We acknowledge the grave abuses that were committed by some members of our Catholic community: physical, psychological, emotional, spiritual, cultural, and sexual.
They also sorrowfully acknowledged the historical and ongoing trauma
and the legacy of suffering and challenges faced by Indigenous peoples that continue to this day.
Avec les entités catholiques qui étaient directement impliquées dans le fonctionnement des pensionnats
et qui ont déjà présenté leurs propres excuses avec sincérité,
we, the Catholic Bishops of Canada, express our profound remorse and apologize
unequivocally.
We are fully committed to the process of healing and reconciliation.
En plus des nombreuses initiatives pastorales déjà en cours dans les diocèses à travers le pays,
et comme une autre expression tangible de cet engagement continu,
we're pledging to undertake fundraising in each region of the country to support initiatives discerned locally with Indigenous partners.
Furthermore, we invite the Indigenous peoples to journey with us into a new era of reconciliation, helping us in each of our dioceses across the country to prioritize initiatives of healing, to listen to the experience of Indigenous peoples,
especially to the survivors of Indian residential schools, and to educate our clergy, consecrated men and women, and lay faithful on Indigenous cultures and spirituality.
We commit ourselves to continue the work
of providing documentation or records that will assist in the memorialization
of those buried in unmarked graves.
Ayant entendu les demandes d'inviter le pape François à s'impliquer dans ce processus de réconciliation,
a delegation of Indigenous survivors,
elders, knowledge keepers, and youth
will meet with the Holy Father in Rome in December of this year.
Pope Francis will encounter and listen to the Indigenous participants so as to discern how he can support our common desire to renew relationships and walk together along the path of hope in the coming years.
We pledge to work with the Holy See and our Indigenous partners
on the possibility of a pastoral visit by the Pope to Canada.
Canada is part of this healing journey.
Dire dena sonchina dena u, inna dena u, berank au dena e hotena dena hotia bera, nadaritia hori isi.
Standing in respect of your resiliency,
strength, and wisdom,
we look forward to listening to and learning from you
as we walk in
We
solidarity.
walk in solidarity.
Walk in solidarity.
I pray that this evening has been an opportunity for education, prayer, and reflection. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission report identified a number of calls to action, including specific action for religious communities involved in operating residential schools. We are making significant efforts to journey forward together. The recently announced visit to Canada by the Holy Father, our work to educate clergy and parishioners, the pledge to commit $30 million towards healing and reconciliation, and the ongoing partnerships with Indigenous people that have taken place throughout the country for so many years. These concrete steps have allowed us to respond to the pain that so many have experienced. We still have significant work to do, but we are moving forward. I invite you to join in solidarity and to find your own role in healing and reconciliation with Indigenous peoples, whether it's through prayer, self-education, financial support, or some other means. I encourage you in your efforts. And I ask for your prayers as the Church continues to find its way to true and lasting healing and reconciliation. I want to thank you very much for joining in tonight's virtual Cardinals Dinner. May the Lord bless you and keep you. May the Lord make his face shine upon you and be gracious to you. May the Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you his peace. Saint Catherine de Caquita, pray for us. Good night.